Hello, today we're going to be talking about blended learning best practices, and this is actually a interactive session, even though it is recorded. So on this screen here, you will see a link to the presentation. You want to go ahead and open that up and have that open as you watch this, because there will be points where I'll pause and have you do activities, and the links to that are in the presentation that are linked here. Please do keep in mind that the J and the A in that link are capitalized, because this is a case-sensitive link. So I will pause now and give you all a second to get that open. Okay, so today's objective really is fourfold. We're going to start off by trying to understand the why behind blended learning and why that's important for us. Two is we're going to talk about what is our role, and really kind of understand what is our role in blended learning, especially in this time of learning from distance while we're teaching from home and students are learning at home. Third, we'll talk about the how, so actually kind of get a high level view of how do we do this thing of blended learning. And then finally, kind of talk about some other tidbits, some other things to keep in mind and possibly help to kind of temper out and round out our understanding of blended learning. So let's get started. We're going to talk about identifying the why. And let's start with, what is your why? Okay. And that's really important. Too often we get caught in the weeds of things. It's really important for us to really think about why it is that we're doing this. Why didn't we just pack up and end school at spring break? There's a reason behind that. So what I want you to do is I want you to pause the video here in just a second and watch this 40-second clip by Simon Sinek, and then write down your own version of why. So go ahead and pause the video and do this activity. So as many of y'all probably wrote down, I would imagine your whys, you probably weren't talking about things like we want to make sure kids get grades, or we want to make sure kids are doing their work. I would imagine if you were really, if you really look at what you're talking about is what things that are best for kids, and probably something along the lines of making sure that our kids are learning. And so we have to rethink some of the things that we make priorities sometimes in a traditional learning environment. Now, because if learning is most important, then some things like grading or late work or allowing redos or the amount of work we give, when we really make learning the focus and the why, you have to think differently about those kinds of things. So we'll take a few minutes here and really talk about what does it mean to remember what is important, and thinking about in this time where everybody's learning environment is going to be different, especially different from a traditional environment where everybody's in a classroom together. We have to remember this. So the first thing that we really want to remember as important is that we all have needs. And so I have up here two charts. They're actually very, very similar in the sense on the left side, you have Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And on the right side, you have the Black Book Nation's hierarchy of needs. And they're basically the similar charts. But if you take, for example, maybe a family with a single mother, has three kids, maybe one kid is just kind of what you would think of the normal gen ed students. You have maybe one of her kids is exceptional with ADD, and maybe they're GT and then are dyslexic or something like that. And then you have another that is maybe special needs or something like that. And so you got a single mother. Now she's having to stay home with all three kids. And let's say that because of that, she was laid off. Okay, for that mother, she is not concerned with at that moment the needs at the top of that triangle. She's not concerned, and the kids are not concerned with the stuff at the top of the triangle. So they're not really concerned with whether or not they get an assignment done on time. They're trying to make sure there's food on the table and rent's paid and those type of things. So they're down to the physiological and safety needs. And so we have to remember that we have kids that are living there right now. And we have other kids that, they're like my kids, where for them it was deciding which computer to use. They had multiple to work from, trying to And, am I, their biggest concern is whether or not the Wi-Fi is going to slow down. Um, and so that's the kind of the first thing is we do have to understand the 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 very, very different lives that our kids have to live. Um, a second thing there is understanding that grace is really, really important at this time. So this is another one. I'm going to ask you to pause and click on that link and read that article, and then think through these questions. Um, or read it in light of, okay, how do we need to do grades different? How do we need to think about due dates and attendance? Um, and really, how important are these things in terms of learning? So I'm going to pause for a minute and let you think that through. Okay, so when we think about that and we think about, okay, we really got to show kids a lot of grace in this time. And you start thinking about things like if we really want learning to be the most important thing, then some things like numeric grades, like we really have to think about why are we doing it the way that we've always done it. If we're being really honest, in a traditional learning environment, it's really more about the grade than it is about the learning. We go to school to get a grade. The thought is not we go to school to learn. And in most cases, that numeric grade doesn't actually tell us anything. It's not telling us how much we know about something. It's really more of a stigma. As opposed to if we put learning at the center, um, the reason behind the grade changes because it should be about, if I have an 80, I should know exactly what that 80 means. I should know what content I still don't know, and so that feedback is different. Giving it like a real life example, and this will kind of make grades and due dates kind of make sense. My son, he was riding his bicycle or learning to ride a bicycle much later than his cousin. So it wasn't until my son was about 6 years old that he was riding a bicycle without training wheels. Well, if we said that, hey son, you need to learn how to ride your bicycle by 5 years old, and he doesn't get to that point, he doesn't get it done, we can assess him and say he was 50% successful. And then we don't give him a chance to continue to learn, well, then he's always just going to be 50% successful. And that just doesn't make any sense. That's not how we actually learn. And it's the same way with redos. If we don't give students the chance to redo grades, redo the learning to continue to improve, then it's like telling my son, well, dude, sorry, you didn't make it by 5 years old, so I guess you're just never going to ride a bicycle now. It just doesn't make any sense. Another thing to really remember that is important is what the learning should look like. So this is our learning framework, and what we have here has not changed because we've gone digital. Matter of fact, I think going digital further really just proves the point that what we're talking about here, this is stuff that kind of transcends, and it's true of any learning environment. So we want our kids to grow. We want our kids to learn. We want our kids to connect, and this is even more important now in a virtual environment because if we don't help our kids connect in the stuff that we're doing, there are some kids that just aren't going to have a connection to anybody else, and that's really important. Impact is really important. I'll discuss it more in the later section, but you got to remember, you are now 100% dependent upon a kid making the decision to do work. You can't pressure them. You can't really do anything remotely to get them to do work. And so one of the best ways to get kids to learn is to make the learning meaningful to them, to have that learning has an impact, which kind of leads to agency. Now more than any time in a traditional setting, the learning is about, or designing of the learning is about, how do we give kids agency? How do we, not give kids, how do we empower kids to have agency in learning? How do we encourage them and entice them to want to learn on their own? Because that's exactly what we're asking them to do now. And then the last thing, as remembering what's important, is we have to remember sometimes less is more when it comes to instruction. another way to think that is we want to think deep, we don't want to think width, we don't want to think breadth. And I'll give you an example. If you assign as practice for a week's learning that they have to do 15 math problems, for example, the thing is, if they don't know it in the first 5 problems, they are not going to get it in the last 10. And conversely, if they know it in the first 5, they don't need the last 10. And so it's about designing learning that has a deeper impact and takes them deeper than it is about doing a lot of the same thing. So remember, when you're designing lessons and designing effective lessons, that it is okay for there to be, from a timeline, chronologically, less work as long as the work goes deeper. Okay, so now let's pivot a little bit. Now we have talked about why we really have a focus on learning and kind of some things to keep in mind and keep in the forefront. But let's talk about how our role has changed because of that. And so what I want to do first is, because we're going to be talking about blended learning and you may not know what that term actually means, is I want you to pause. I want you to take you 3 minutes to go and research blended learning. So just open a new tab in Google and Google blended learning and do a little bit of research and see what you find, because when we come back, that'll help inform that. Okay, so you're back now. So we're going to kind of think through these 4 questions. And notice they are similar questions. So the first 2 are tied together and the second 2 are tied together. So we'll take the first 2. How is blended learning different than traditional learning? And how is blended learning similar to traditional learning? I have a typo there. So take a minute and jot down some ideas, and you can input a Venn diagram, which is what I'm going to show you next. So I'm going to give you about a minute if you want to go ahead and pause the video and think that through. Okay, so I don't know what's on your list, and there's a whole multitude of things, but this was just myself doing just a quick, let me jot down about 2 or 3 minutes, some things that are different and that are similar between blended and traditional learning environments. And just so you know, when I'm using the term traditional, I just mean what things looked like 6 weeks ago. Okay, what we were doing in our brick and mortar schools a few weeks ago. So that's not traditional in the sense that we're talking about rows and lecture and scantrons. That I don't mean that. I just mean not completely online learning. So I'm just going to quickly go through some of these. One thing you got to keep in mind in a blended learning environment, it really is the students are dictating what the schedule looks like, not the school. So it's not kids go to this for 45 minutes and then they do this for 45 minutes. And even inside of that, the teacher's saying we're going to do this for 5 and this for 10 or whatever. Really, the students are dictating that. You're just giving suggestions. Second is there's a difference between participation and attendance. Okay, so in traditional, we're really about attendance. We want kids to show up every day, but in a blended environment, we only want them to participate in the learning that's been designed. So whether that's discussions, whether that's discussion boards, or just completing the work, we're really looking at how do we get kids to stay involved in what's going on versus just showing up. Okay, something that you might be, hooping and hollering about is the fact that you're not the disciplinarian in this blended environment. The disciplinarian is really on the parent side, which we'll talk about later. So in traditional roles where you're having to take a lot of time to redirect, to tell kids to stay on task, to get work done, you're not doing that now, which that does free you up to do some other things. Now, one that can be hard to swallow is in a blended environment, you are no longer the sole source of truth. Traditionally, kids come to school because the school is the holders of the knowledge. That is where you go and learn these things because you are the expert. Well, now there's you, and there's YouTube, and there's Google, and there's Khan Academy, and there's all kinds of other places where students can learn information. So your job is now no longer to be their sole source of truth, but more the curator of that truth, to make sure that kids are going to the right places to learn information. Now, there are some things that are similar about blended and traditional learning. First, learning happens in both models, and that never changes. Second is the teach still exists. So you still have to follow standard. You still have to teach. You need to do those things, and you still care for your kids. You want to make sure that your kids are doing well. You're still assigning work to kids. So there are some kind of the nuts and bolts practicality stuff that's still happening. Those things are still happening. Okay. So then going back to the last two questions. Okay, because this is a totally different model, we have to think, what is the role of a teacher in blended learning, and what is the role of a parent? And that's not a question. Number 4 is not a question we typically would ask in a traditional environment because the parent's not in the room. But now that it's blended, the parent very much is in the room with the students, and we have to understand that. So if we look at roles here, and I'll deal with the teachers first, really, and again, this goes back to our learner framework, there's 3 major roles of a teacher, and that hasn't changed from the classroom to virtual. It just maybe looks a little bit different. Is that teachers are designers, collaborators, and pioneers. Now, when I talk about design, there's really 2 main things I'm talking about there. First is they're curator. So again, you're not the sole source of truth anymore. And so that means you have to do a really good job of curating the resources you want your students to use to be able to learn the content and learn the skills that you're trying to teach. And you have to understand that if you don't curate that for them, the kids will do it themselves, and they won't always find the right information. So you do have to curate it. Second is you're actually serving the role of a coach. Okay, you're there to support them. You're there to give them feedback. You're there to talk to them one-on-one and give them guidance on how to improve. You're there to assess what they know and to give them feedback on that so they continue to grow. That's part of that designer. And then obviously you're designing the learning environment. As a collaborator, you may be used to the idea of collaborating teacher to teacher. You may be used to collaborating teacher and student. But now there's this added element of you have to collaborate as a teacher with a parent, more so than you ever had before. And that really starts with that planning or the lesson template that is posted for parents, and making sure that that is really clear for parents to be able to guide their kids. All right, third, and you're a pioneer. You are trying new things. You're trying new things every day now. And one of those things that as a pioneer is because you know slightly more about a tool than the students that you're asking to do the work with, that does mean you have to provide some level of tech support. And so that might be scary, but that's also why we provide supports for you in that. And on the parent has a role in this as well. It used to be they just had to make sure the kids get to school. But now I'm going to do these out of order. They're a provider. That is their first job as a parent. Their first role is they got to make sure they're providing for their kids. And that is, for some parents, that is a huge stressor right now, is making sure that their kids are taken care of. They encourage their kids. They are the disciplinarians for their kids. And then finally, the facilitator. This is really where that collaboration between teacher and parents really comes in. Is they're the ones that are having to answer those small questions that the kids have all day long about how do I do this, how do I do this, and so they are not coaching their kids; they are facilitating the learner. So content is coming from you, is going to the kid, and the parents having to play the mediator in between. And so you really got to think through it as you're designing learning. How do I help that parent be a really good facilitator of learning? They are never at any point expected to be the teacher. That is your job. But you got to help them facilitate. Okay, so now let's get to maybe some more of the nuts and bolts. How the learning should happen. Okay. So in a traditional model, we follow the do now, I do, we do, you do, exit ticket kind of model. That's how we kind of deliver instruction. That process, for the most part, is still true in a blended learning environment. And as you can see there, I have it listed off to the right in parentheses. But there's a couple things that we don't do. We don't do nows, we don't do exit tickets in the traditional sense. Because the purpose of a do now is to get the kids as they come into your class ready for the learning for the day or for the class period. But because this is asynchronous, you just don't do that. There's not a need for it. And so that's why you won't notice, or you notice I don't have a do now here. And as far as exit tickets, that's actually tied into the feedback because it's not every kid finishing at one time. They finish at different times. And so your feedback looks different. So in a blended learning environment, those 4 key pieces are the delivery of content, the practice of the content, feedback from the teacher or from peers about the practice, and then assessment. And so I did separate practice and feedback. In a traditional model, practice and feedback would be done at the same time. Kids are working on assignment and you're walking the room and giving feedback on how that is done. But you can't do that in an online environment always. So sometimes they have to practice and they get the feedback later. Okay, so let's talk about each one of these in a little bit more detail. So delivery, some things to consider with delivery is, are you going to deliver it synchronous or asynchronous? So are you going to have everybody together at one time virtually to hear the content that you're delivering, or is it going to be pre-recorded and kids get it whenever they want to access it? And it's not an either or. The idea is, if you do something synchronous, you actually have, say, a Google Meet, and you have the kids all come together, or at least all that are available, and you have a class meeting, and you teach something new, you need to record it so that those that weren't there are able to access it. That's what we mean by synchronous and asynchronous. And I'll talk about how to do that here in just a minute. Second thing to consider is student choice. So one very important thing with blended learning is that choice and voice are very important. And what we mean by that is the student getting choice in the ways in which they learn and a voice in how they do that. And so that can be done even with the delivery. You can give choice in how the students actually learn the content, how they get that delivery of content. And you can give them some options on what they do. So you can give, maybe once they join the meet, or they can watch the recording, or they can watch these 1 or 2 YouTube videos they curated, or go to the site, or go to Khan Academy, or, one of many different avenues to get the content. You can give them choice of that. Now, one important thing I want to say about student choice right now is that though you can give student choice in all 4 of those areas, you do not, and I would not recommend giving them choice in all 4 areas at the same time. So one week it may be choice in delivery, it may be choice in practice, and the next week maybe it's a choice in assessment. But trying to do choice in all of them is going to drive you crazy, and it's going to make it complicated for the kids. So giving choice in elements of the lesson design, but not all of the pieces at the same time is what I would recommend. Okay, so delivery, although what you see bulleted there are different ways in which you can deliver content, and on the right are tools that we recommend. Now, I do want to say, as kind of a disclaimer, these are not the only tools that you can use to do these things. The reason we have them listed here is because these are ones that we have previously done training on, or that we plan to do training on, and so we have support built in. If you use something else, say Newsela or Kahoot, feel free to use those, or you're using Loom or something like that. Feel free to continue using those. We are not telling you not to do them, and we're just saying we already have supports built in for these. So as far as delivery, screencasting, video, text, which we mean actual documents, so this could be websites or something you type up, something they read, audio only, images, video chats. Those are all ways that you can deliver content to students. Just remember, if you're doing something like a video chat like Meet, make sure you record it and then share it with the kids, which then makes it also video. And you can see the tools there that we recommend for that. For practice and feedback, I am kind of combining these together. The reason for that is, in some cases, you can actually give them feedback in real time. In other cases, you can't. So things to consider as you are thinking through the design of how the kids are going to practice an assignment and get feedback is one, do you want that feedback to be automatic and instant? There are some ways to do it, but you have to decide that before you give the activity. Some else to consider is feedback needs to be personalized to the student. Again, you're thinking differently about grades. Telling a kid or telling all the kids that just a letter grade or the number grade that they got, oh, you made a 75, you made an 85, you made a 50, actually doesn't help them learn anything because they don't know what that number means unless you say you made an 80 because there were 5 things that you were working on and you knew these 4, you did not know this one. So you need to go practice this one thing. That's meaningful and that makes that grade mean something. So the feedback needs to be personalized. Something else to consider is, do you want to use peer feedback? And so there are cases in which that might be something you want to do. And then finally, feedback is, does the feedback need to be in the form of intervention? Meaning you have pockets of kids that all need kind of the same feedback, and then you can pull them together and do feedback that way. Okay, so with the practice, there's actually several different things we'll talk about here, but first is activities. And I just use activities generally because y'all are doing a lot of amazing things, and I wasn't going to try to pigeonhole you into something. So whatever activity that you're doing with the kids, for example, using tools like Wiser, Edpuzzle, G Suite, those are definitely practice. Reflection is a type of practice. So they could have listened to the instruction or participated in the instruction, and then you want them to reflect on what they learned. You can do that with video, audio, or text, and you can see the examples there. I would even put Screencastify as options for video and audio. They can practice with games, and so I'd use quizzes as an example, Kahoot, Deck Toys, Quizalize. There's all kinds of different practice games they could do. They could also practice by creating, and so Adobe Spark is a great creation tool for that. So those are examples there of ways that kids can practice. And then as far as feedback, ways that you can provide feedback to the students. If you're using G Suite, you can use the comment feature, or if you're Google Classroom, you can give feedback through the comment tool inside the actual assignment. And I believe you can do the same thing in Seesaw. So comments are a really powerful tool for that are personalized. Conferencing, so whether you need to talk to a kid one-on-one after seeing their assignment and what they turned in, or if you want to deal with small groups, so you have 3 or 4 kids that are dealing with the same, or 10 or 15 are dealing with the same misconception, you can do conferencing, or you noticed they turn something, the whole class has turned something in, there's misconceptions, you can have a meet and try to address it with everybody. You can give feedback in video and audio with Flipgrid. And then there are ways to do automatic feedback. So for example, if you use Google Forms or Wiser, immediately after they answer, they get feedback on how they did. And with forms, you can do something like a branching form where where if they miss a question, they immediately get redirected to a video or a document or an example to teach them. All right, and then for assessment, and I'm using assessment here because really what we're talking about is ideally if you design the lesson well, you actually only need to give 1 grade a week. Like actual 1 graded assignment. Now, understandably, to get the 9 grades, it may require something else, but as far as being able to assess and say, okay, did the kid learn what they needed to learn for the week? You really only need to do that once a week. And so the idea, or the term I like to use, is the idea of an uncheatable test. And what I mean by that is if the purpose of an assessment is to find out what the kid knows, then the only way to create something that a kid can't cheat on is to create something in which it's impossible for the kid to not show what they're learning. And so a couple of things to keep in mind when you're thinking about how can I, as much as possible, ensure that I know what the kids know. First is you do have to remember Google exists. So if you give a multiple choice quiz at the end of the week, they will Google the answers. They will ask their friends. In some cases, the parents will take it for them. It will happen. And so that is not a good way to assess whether or not a kid actually knows something or not. It's just not. Um, so really, the best ways to assess, and they're not foolproof, they're not uncheatable, but they're closer, is things that are open-ended, where the students are actually having to put their thoughts out or having to respond with video or audio, or where kids have to create in some form or fashion. Those are ways in which you can actually truly assess the learning, and you're more likely to get their understanding versus what they found online or what they got from a parent. Okay, so some examples. So if you want them to create, great tools for that are Adobe Spark and G Suite, where they have to actually make something and share it. So Adobe Spark allows you to create videos, to create graphics, and to create like websites or flyers, so it's lots of different options within the same tool. If it's open-ended, so if it's a open-ended question that they're responding to, verbally or with audio, they use Flipgrid or Screencastify. Spark. If they're writing something, they can do it with G Suite, which includes Google Forms. But in those cases where you do want something automatically graded, that is okay. I'm not saying don't ever do it. I'm just saying it's not as foolproof. You can use something like Google Forms, quizzes can do auto grading. You can even do an activity like Wiser, which gives you a little bit of, combination of both. And so all those are automatic grading and feedback type tools. All right, so finally, some other tidbits, some things to keep in mind as you are going through designing blended learning is first, the first two there kind of go together. You want to make sure that your instructions are really, really clear for both the students and the parents. Because if you make an assumption that the kid knows what you mean by that, you're gonna struggle. So that includes things like don't include abbreviations or slang that you might use in your classroom, because the kid can't clarify that. They can't look that up. So you got to make sure that's super clear. Same thing with expectations. If you want something done a certain way, you need to explain it to the kids beforehand or provide an exemplar so they know what it should look like. Don't just assume if you say, something should be very detailed, for example, that they know what that means. You need to show them this is what very detailed looks like. And so rubrics are a great way, as long as there are student-friendly rubrics, are a great way to help with that, to give them clear expectations. The third example or kind of tidbit is make sure that your directions are actually at the reading level of the kids that are trying to read it. So a great free read source is a tool called Readable. If you actually copy and paste your directions into readable.com, it'll actually tell you what grade level it's written at and let you know if that's actually appropriate for your kids. So check the readability level. Make sure if you're writing directions for a second grader, that it will make sense for a second grader. Okay. All right. Next one is if you're using a new tool, please teach that tool to the kids before you actually start using it, before you actually make it something that's a grade. Because what happens is when you introduce two forms of friction, so the first piece of friction is the tool, and then the new tool, and the second piece of friction is that is graded, you now create a situation where it's hostile, where the kid's going to be stressed, parents going to be stressed. So don't do them both at the same time. Teach the tool and let them play with it and figure out how it works. And then the next week, actually assign something using the tool. Okay. And then both times when you do that, include a link to the help page for both of those tools so that if a parent or a kid has a question, they have someplace to go find answers. All right. Next little tidbit is try to streamline your assignments. Especially if you're in classroom and Seesaw, every time you post, let's say your assignments for the week has 5 parts to it, and you post 5 different pieces. That's 5 different notifications, 5 different things they have to click on, and there's a very high chance that they will actually lose something. It also, if you put all 5 steps inside the directions, it does help a little bit, but what's even better if you use something like a hyperdoc. So instead of having 5 steps, 5 steps with 5 links. There's one link, and inside that are all the steps. That keeps everything nice and streamlined, and it's one place to go to, and it'll make the whole process, the lesson design, go much smoother. Okay. Couple other things to consider is providing your kids with a progress chart so they can track what they've gotten done, what they still have left. So link there is an example of one that I use with my own kids to help them keep track of their assignments and where they're at. Goal setting, if we know that research shows that is very, very effective at helping kids learn. That is true of an online environment as well. So I encourage you to continue to use goal setting with your kids, or if not, have them set goals on what they want to accomplish. It could be what grade they want to reach, how quickly they want to get something done, what new things they want to learn, however you want to set that up. Okay, and the last two, make sure that your classroom, so just in the same way that your actual physical classroom would be organized so that kids can find the resources they need, your virtual classroom needs to be the same way. So whether that's Seesaw or Google Classroom, it needs to be organized in a way that makes sense for a student working on their own to find what you need to find. And I'll just give you a simple example. If you're in Google Classroom, you need to be assigned topics by the week. And so a kid can just go and find the topic that says this is, this week's assignments, and then click there and everything's organized underneath that. All right. Finally, we all know that we have kids that they didn't do the work when they were at school, and they're not necessarily doing the work now. Okay. So what you have to think about is the idea of emotional path of least resistance. And so what I mean by that is we all make decisions based on an emotional level, for the most part. And so for us, the decisions we tend to make are the ones which emotionally we meet the least resistance on. Okay, and that's true of our kids as well. So if we're able to remove some of the roadblocks that create that emotional tension, then we increase the chance for the likelihood they'll do the assignments. And I'll give you a couple examples. If they get frustrated trying to find the work, that's an emotional roadblock. So we make it super organized and super easy for them to find, no roadblock. We increase the likelihood they'll do the work. They don't have access, they're struggling to get access to the work, because of lack of internet or lack of device. We try to get this for them so we can remove those roadblocks. So maybe it's parent lets them watch videos all day. Okay, we can't change what the parent does at home, but we can let parent know, hey, parent, if you will encourage kid to do this, or take the remote from their hands and have them do work, you start to kind of change the course they go. Can you remove all the emotional roadblocks? No, because you don't have access to what's going on at home. But as much as you can, try to make it easier to actually do the work than to not. Okay? All right, with that, I am all done. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to the help desk, to contact us during our virtual office hours, which are 8 to 4 every day, or to call or email your campus help person. Thank you all very much. Have a great day.